The Lord be with you. I've also chosen a passage from Luke's Gospel. It's from chapter 12, and I've edited it down. I just took 3 chunks out of it because they will provide the biblical basis for the homily this morning. Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered, so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak, first to his disciples, saying, "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear in the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the rooftops. Be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. It will be good for those servants whom the master finds watching when he comes. Truly I tell you, he will dress himself to serve, will have them recline at table, and will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the middle of the night or towards daybreak. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not let his house be broken into." Then he said to the crowd, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say, "It's going to rain." And so it does. And when the south wind blows, you say, "It's going to be hot." And it is. You know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? Why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? As you are going with your adversary to the magistrate, try hard to be reconciled on the way. Or your adversary may drag you off to the judge, and the judge turn you over to the officer, and the officer throw you into prison. I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the very last penny. Gospel inspired by God. I'm sure many of you are old enough to remember, certainly George is. When men used cutthroat razors to shave themselves. Do you remember seeing your father, your grandfather doing that? It was a real work of art. So you had to get, a whole soapy water and dab it all over your face. You would have this like Santa Claus beard. And then you take the cutthroat razor and you're scraping under your chin like this. And almost inevitably you're going to nick yourself once or twice in the process. So I remember as a very small boy, maybe 4 or 5 at the time, watching my father. My father was still using the cutthroat razor. And this particular morning, he nicked himself a few times. And so at the end of it, after he washed off his face and patted his face, he noticed there's a few blotches of blood, a few places still bleeding. So he turns around and he takes off a tiny little piece of toilet paper in order to stick it to the places that are bleeding. Yeah, you've all seen that happen. And then he turns to leave the bathroom, and my mother's going in, and she says, "Paddy, what are those pieces of blood-soaked toilet paper doing on the mirror?" So you take a child from 0 to 2, a little girl less than 2 years old, and you stand her in front of a mirror, and she will not recognize herself. She'll want to interact with the other child. And they've done experiments. You put a little red dot on the child's, cheek here, unbeknownst to her, and she comes up and she's looking in the mirror. If she sees the spot at all, she thinks it's on the other child, and she's trying to rub it off the little child. But mainly, she doesn't realize that that's not another kid. She says, "Baby, baby, baby," and she thinks it's another child out there. By age 3, the brain has developed sufficiently that when you put a child in front of a mirror, she knows immediately, that's me. So we recognize ourselves. But it's interesting that even in the animal kingdom, there are species that recognize their own images. So they've done experiments, for instance, with elephants in Africa. You can take a huge big elephant and put a sticking plaster on his cheek, big white cross on its band on its cheek, unbeknownst to it, pretend you're patting it, and then bring it up to this huge big mirror, and the elephant will recognize that this is me, and there's a patch on my face, and will use his trunk to try to wipe it away. So it's obviously recognizing itself. They've done the same thing with chimpanzees. And you can try to fool a chimp by putting something on his face, and then show it a mirror, and it'll recognize immediately, that's me, and there's something on my face, and I'm going to rub it off. So that's what I'm going to focus on today for a few minutes. Because the essence of the spiritual journey has to do with self-awareness. But there are many levels of self-awareness. The little 3-year-old girl is just becoming self-aware where she recognizes that physical being in the mirror is actually me. So we've identified our awareness as a physical self-awareness. At some stage, we begin to identify with our feelings. We think we are our feelings. We think that is who I really am, the emotions I'm experiencing. Later on in life, we begin to identify with the thoughts we have. We think we are our thoughts. At some other stage, we begin to identify with relationships we're in. I'm Peggy ÓLaoire's son, or this is my wife or my husband, or whatever. And then we begin to identify with professions we're in. I'm a farmer, I'm a cellist, or whatever I have to be. The journey isn't complete until we really self-identify, until we're totally self-aware, and we realize that we're bite-sized pieces of God who volunteered for human incarnation. So we have to keep birthing ourselves again and again and again until we give birth to God, until we realize that really we are God stuff that volunteered for incarnation. And that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm going to make 3 main points this morning. And the first one is, I'm going to talk about the scientific method. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about how we dismantle the matrix in which we find ourselves. And then thirdly, I'm going to give 3 suggestions, 3 New Year's resolutions to help our New Year evolution. So those are the 3 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, I want to put it on a scientific basis. Any science you study, whether it's geology or psychology or physics or whatever it is, or spirituality, there's a system to it. And it goes a little bit like this. The first thing any good scientist does is to make a bunch of observations in her field of interest. Those observations generate data. She then looks at her data to see if she can identify some kind of a putative pattern in the data. If she thinks she has, seen some kind of a pattern, she'll create a hypothesis to explain the pattern. But it's still only a hypothesis. Stage number 5 is she has to set up an experiment to test her hypothesis to see if it really accounts for the data. If it proves to be so, it has to be replicated in 1 or 2 other laboratories to make sure it's just not a statistical fluctuation. And if all the other laboratories come for the same result, now you've established a scientific principle in the field. You put together a bunch of principles in any field, and now you have a scientific model of the field that explains the data. But at some stage, inevitably, new anomalous data are going to present themselves from new observations, and now you're going to have to try to tweak the model to accommodate the new data. Finally, there will be so much anomalous data coming in that the old model proves to be radically inadequate, and you've got to dismantle it and create a brand new model that can explain all of the old data and accommodate all of the new data. And that happened to us twice in the 20th century with relativity theory and with quantum mechanics. Now, it's true, then it becomes a cycle. This new model allows us to observe in a different fashion, which generates new data that allow us to create new hypotheses and new tests. So it's a spiral, an evolutionary spiral. But it is true not just for geology or for physics or for mathematics or just even for psychology, it's true for our spirituality as well. We have to be scientists of the spirit. So there's a more compact model of the scientific method that I'll just run by you quickly. And it's just a 4-part model. And this is a pattern recognition, inference, prediction, and control. So you take any scientist, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to identify patterns. We have an ability as human beings to fill in the missing pieces. As little kids, all of you got colour books where there was a series of dots on the page, and you were told, there's a kangaroo hidden in there someplace. And what you have to do is you have to join the dots in such a way that you recognize the kangaroo. So somehow the pattern was in there, but you had to fill out the blanks. Or if I gave you a circle, I drew a circle for you, but I just gave you a series of dots. I give you 7 or 8 dots. But if they're arranged in a certain kind of a curve, you'll fill in the rest of it and say, oh, that's a circle. If I were to do it differently, you'd say, oh, that's a square. No, it actually isn't a square or a circle. It's just a bunch of dots, but you're filling in the blanks. So the first thing a scientist needs to do is to kind of either identify patterns where they exist or create them, fill in the blanks where they don't fully exist. Then the second stage is to make inferences from the pieces you've filled in. So if you're a caveman living 70,000 years ago and you're walking through the bush and the corner of your eye, you see a tail swinging, and that's all you see, you're going to run like hell. In your mind, you filled in, this is a saber-toothed tiger. So you filled in the blanks, sometimes rightly and sometimes wrongly. Sometimes what you take to be a snake is just a piece of vine on the ground. But we make inferences. And it is these inferences that allow us to create laws and models, like we understand what gravity is. So the inferences from the pattern recognition create the models and the laws for us. If the laws were really good, they should allow us the ability to be able to predict. If A typically leads to B, if that's the law, and A has just happened, I'm going to predict B is shortly going to occur. And so the third stage is we make predictions. And the fourth stage is that the predictions allow us a measure of control over our environment. We can now begin, because we've seen patterns, we've made inferences, we've created laws, we've made predictions. Now we can learn how to work with the situation, whether it's a relationship. You know that in a particular situation, this person acts in such and such a fashion. Now, you can be careful not to arouse them, or you can in some way manipulate them, because you can control their behavior by recognizing the patterns, making the inferences, and be able to make the predictions. So we use this in all manner of means, in our relationships, and as well in our spirituality. So Jesus is talking about this morning, this beautiful passage, where he says, you say, if the wind is coming from the west, you say it's going to rain. And so it does. You say the wind is coming from the south, it's going to be really, really hot. And it is. If you figure out how to prognosticate about the weather, why can't you look at life? Now, what was the deal here? If you lived in Israel and the wind was coming from the west, it was coming in over the Mediterranean. So it was bringing rain with it. So of course it was going to rain. If it was coming from the south, it was coming from the Judean desert. So it was becoming really, really, really hot. So Christ is saying, you need to be scientists of the soul. You need to be able to look at the situation in which you find yourself and make kind of inferences and predictions that allow you a measure of control over your life. So to be a true spiritual person, you have to engage some with the scientific model. So that's my first point. Second point then, I want to talk about dismantling the matrix. Because every single one of us is born and educated in some kind of a program. There's a term going around right now, I hear a lot about it, called fake news. And it's fascinating to me, because the more I look at it, the more I realize that the people who are shouting fake news, are the people who've been always promoting the fake news. History is always written by the winners. It's the court historians that give us the accounts of what happened in bygone times. If you're going to read two histories, one written by a court historian and one written by a prophet, which one should you believe? The court historian is just dealing in propaganda. The other one is dealing with truth. So very, very often we're being told that it's these fringe groups that are, promoting fake news. But the fake news artists are the mainstream media, as far as I can see. They're just tools of propaganda for some kind of an oligarchy. The same people who are shouting foul, fake news, and pointing to fringe organizations are the people who gave you weapons of mass destruction, for the Iraq war, as a pretext to kill 750,000 Iraqi children through sanctions, and then go in and kill 100,000 Iraqi soldiers, and then create bedlam in Iraq for the interim period. The same people who are crying fake news, are the people who persuaded us that Assad was using biological weapons, so that we went in and we murdered thousands of Syrians and created one of the biggest refugee problems in our hands right now. The same people who are calling fake news are the people who tried to persuade us that the Patriot Act was patriotic, or that the NDAA, the National Defence Authorization Act, was actually giving us security, when in fact it's dismantling our Constitution and undermining our security. So be very careful when you hear the phrase fake news, because mostly the people who are pointing the fingers and making the claims of others are the people who have been promoting fake news all our lives. They're the people who reduce, it's the essence of fundamentalism. The essence of fundamentalism, whether it's political or religious, is that you take a very complex situation, you reduce it down to a few simplistic dogmas, you identify some kind of an enemy, and then you make war on that enemy. We've been doing this for 5,000 years, empire after empire after empire. So be very, very careful. Anybody who reduces a complex phenomenon to one line, that person is dealing with fake news. So we need to kind of break out of this mindset and begin researching for ourselves. We need to realize that every single one of us is programmed. You can't be raised in a family without taking on the family program. You can't be raised in a culture without taking on the culture program. Kids just soak in their values. And so typically from birth to about age 6, kids are just these little egocentric creatures who only understand 2 rules. If I do this, I get punished. If I do that, I get rewarded. So I'm not going to do the stuff that's going to get me punished, and I am going to do the stuff that gets me rewarded. It's a totally egocentric little model up to age 6. By about 7, kids have learned, they're now, for the first time ever, they're capable of moral decisions. A 5-year-old child is neither moral nor amoral, or immoral, simply amoral. It doesn't have the ability to walk in anybody else's moccasins. Now, by about age 7, the age of reason has kicked in, and you can teach kids rules and roles. And now there are 2 other things to think about. You now are taught to do things that reward the tribe and to avoid things that punish the tribe. And so now you become ethnocentric. Where you had been egocentric, you are now ethnocentric. What's good for my tribe or what's bad for my tribe, and that dictates my actions. But about age 12 or 13, every single child reaches a place of real self-reflection. When we begin to look at our own actions, our family's values, and our culture's behavior, and we begin to say, why are we invading this place? Why are we killing people half us across the world with drones? Tell me again. And so we begin to question, because the child naturally is moving into the 3rd phase, which is either ecocentric thinking or cosmic-centered thinking, where we're thinking as a species or thinking as a member of all sentient beings. And what happens, society slaps us down. Society doesn't want anybody moving beyond ethnocentricity. And so the deep programming goes really, really deep, and it takes a real courageous character to start questioning the values with which I was brought up, either in my family or in my church or in my nation, and begin really thinking for myself. If I'd been born in a different culture at the very same period of time, I'd have a totally different belief system. So how can I believe that they're the bad guys and we're the good guys? So fundamentalism always creates an enemy. And the enemy, the stages are, you identify the enemy, you dehumanize them, and then you make war on them. And we're always the good guys. Even though we are doing the same things that they are doing, we're justified in doing it because that's the only kind of language they understand. So if you want to deal with them, you have to do what they do. You have to lie and steal and cheat and kill. But in our case, it's good because we're the good guys. And in their case, it's bad because they're the bad guys. And if we'd been born in their shoes, it would be reversed exactly. So we need to break beyond that kind of thinking, as adolescents and as adults. But very, very often, our TVs, don't tell us that. One of the most important things to do, a New Year's resolution, would be to kill your TV and your radio, because you're not getting real news. It's neither real nor new. It's the same crap again and again and again that we've been heard for 5,000 years. It's not, it's leading to xenophobia and fear and anxiety and anger against a whole bunch of people. So you need to be researching for yourself and really figuring out what the truth is. Self-awareness as an individual and as a culture. So in other words, every single one of us is called upon to be a prophet. And the essence of prophecy, the prophet is not the person who prognosticates about the future or foretells what is yet to come. That's kind of just a symptom of it. The essence of the prophet is that the prophet is the person who calls us back into alignment with the covenant. In Judaism, that was the function of the prophet. The function of the prophet was not to foretell the future. Jeremiah was the first one to say, this is just a symptom of whether you're a real prophet or not. You tell the future. But that's not the essence of being a prophet. The essence of any prophet is that the prophet is the one among us who calls us back into alignment with the contract or the covenant. And every single one of us has made a covenant, a contract. Every single soul sitting on planet Earth right now, before we were born, we raised our hand and we said to God, send me. I realize that planet Earth is in deep, deep doo-doo right now. I want to go down there and I want to do something about it. That's the contract. You have an individual contract to wake yourself up. You have a contract to help wake others up. And you've got a contract to create Christ consciousness in our planet. That's the contract. And the function of the prophet is to call us back into alignment with that. So prognosticating the future is merely a side effect for this following reason. The prophet is the only person among us who really sees the present clearly. The rest of us we see the propaganda or the programming that we brought up with. The prophet sees the present clearly. The prophet sees the program clearly. The prophet sees the propaganda clearly. And the prophet sees the program clearly. And therefore the prophet is able to indicate, here's guys where we're headed. If you see a section of a graph on a blackboard, and the ends of it are occluded, you can guess pretty much where the graph is headed. If it's irregular, if it's a sine wave, for instance, or it's a straight line, you could say that's probably where it's headed. That's what the prophet does. The prophet sees the present really clearly, the propaganda, the programming, and the players really clearly, and can see, here's guys, it's where it's headed if we don't change our behavior. So there's a subspecialty in mathematics called vector analysis. And a vector simply is a factor that has both quantity and direction. So for instance, speed wouldn't be a vector, but velocity is. So speed is just an amount, 40 miles an hour. Velocity is 40 miles an hour in a northwest direction. So a vector is something that has both quantity and direction to it. Now imagine, planet Earth is a huge big rock to which we've attached 7 billion different ropes. And each person is pulling in a particular direction. A vector analyst, a mathematician, by summing the forces on the rock, can tell you precisely in what direction the rock is actually going to move and at what speed, by summing all the factors. Now, the truth is that there's not 7 billion of us pulling in 7 billion different directions. We're pulling in clusters. You join a church and you're told this is the direction to pull in. You join a corporation, you're told that's the direction to pull in. You become a politician, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, that's the direction you need to pull in. So basically, when I look around, there are maybe 50 or 60 clusters of people pulling the rock in various directions. But when you sum the forces, you can see that this particular rock that we call planet Earth is heading for the cliff. It's being pulled over the cliff. And it's mainly by a kind of an ecological arrogance and a passion for war making. Both of them driven by, megalomania and greed. And the function of the prophet is to say, no, this can't be. We cannot allow this to happen. So the prophet, each one of us, needs to be a meme maker. You need to create a new narrative, a new storyline, which is so attractive that you get a whole bunch of people to start pulling in the same direction now. That should be the function of religion, but it hasn't been the function of religion in the past. So there needs to be a new cluster of people dedicated to love, pulling in the same direction before this rock goes over the cliff. That's my second point. The third point, I want to suggest then 3 practices that I would say, resolutions that allow for a new year evolution. So where do we move from here? So the first resolution I would suggest is becoming more and more conscious as a person, becoming more and more self-aware of who you really are and who your friends are and who your enemies are. You do not have enemies. You've got people, you've got other facets of God inviting you into transcendence, into evolution. So every one of us starts off, and we've got what I call some kind of a personal cosmology, for want of a better term. And a personal cosmology is just an internalized belief system that allows you to act in a particular fashion in a particular situation. Now, this personal cosmology has been unconsciously acquired. You got it from your parents, you got it from your siblings, you got it from school authorities, you got it from politicians, you got it from churches, but you acquired it unconsciously. You're not even aware what the elements of it are. If you were to be asked, can you sit down and write, what your cosmology is? Most of us couldn't put more than 3 or 4 statements together. So it's unconsciously acquired, and moreover, it's unconsciously accessed. You put us in any situation, and we'll act in a particular fashion. And if I were to say to you, Bernadette, why did you say that? It seemed like it was the right thing to say. George, why did you do that? Felt like that was the right thing to do. So what made it the right thing to say or do? An internalized, unconscious cosmology. And so it's unconsciously accessed because it's been unconsciously acquired. It becomes really, really important as adults that we bring that cosmology to consciousness and really examine it, because it's riddled through with programming from all these forces. And this is what Christ is talking about, becoming more and more, being awake so that when the Master comes, he finds you awake. The most important virtue in the spiritual arsenal is being awake. It's more important than love. Because in the absence of being awake, what appears to be love is mere mawkish sentimentality. And that's why, Gautama Siddhartha would call himself the Buddha. I am awake. And why Jesus would make these parables again and again and again. Blessed is that householder whom the Master finds awake when he comes. So you can't be a spiritual person unless you're an awake person. Going to school does not educate you. Going to school consciously will educate you. Living does not, make you an enlightened being. Living consciously makes you an enlightened being. So bringing stuff to consciousness, that's the first resolution. To live your life with as much consciousness as possible for yourself. The second suggestion I would make is, some kind of a feedback loop. And I would suggest that there are 4 kinds of feedback which are important. The first one is, I call it solicited feedback, where you ask a friend, or you ask a therapist, or you ask a spiritual director, here's the situation I find myself in, can you afford me some kind of guidance here? So you're soliciting feedback from somebody whom you admire or think is a wise person. And that's very important, because it allows you to kind of develop your spirituality in a scientific fashion. The second kind of feedback is unsolicited feedback. People are going to give you feedback that you don't want to hear it from, the enemy figures or whatever. And mostly, they will exaggerate it wildly, and they'll take great glee in doing it. But if you're getting the same kind of feedback from several different people, maybe it's worthwhile sitting down and saying, is there possibly some nugget here that I can harvest from this, rather than dismiss it all? Is there anything there I need to attend to? I'm not saying you have to accept it or believe any of it, but at least you have to examine it. And when I lived in Kenya, what I found out really, really quickly, with working with nomadic pastoralists who were being settled into an agricultural lifestyle for which they had no tradition, that when you planted maize in Kenya on the equator where I lived, and there was torrential rain for 2 months, and it was barren for the rest, that weeding was much more important than fertilizing. If you had to choose between weeding it and fertilizing it, weeding was far more important. Fertilizer was blind. You throw fertilizer down on the equator in torrential rain, and the weeds come up, and the grasses come up, and the maize come up, and it's a jungle there. If you had to choose between them, weeding is much more important if you want to harvest. So how about setting about, looking at the feedback I'm receiving and begin weeding as a result of what I'm hearing, weeding in my own personality. The third one is an idea that the Jesuits came up with several years ago. Each of us, when we were growing up as Catholics, we were told the examination of conscience. Before you went to a confession on a Saturday night, you examined your conscience. How many lies did I tell? How frequently? But much more importantly than an examination of conscience is what the Jesuits call consciousness examine. With what level of awareness have I lived my week or my day? So I think it's a beautiful exercise at the end of the day to look back at the day and say, if I were to grade myself on a scale of 0 to 10 on the awareness with which I've lived the day, where would I land? Would it be a 3 or a 7? Or to make it easier, just take a particular relationship I'm in and say, in the course of this day, if I just look at that relationship, with how much awareness did I actually live that relationship today? And so that would be a kind of a self-imposed, feedback loop. And the fourth one I would suggest would be, I would call it an imaginative feedback. It's what Ken Wilber would call multi-perspectiving. The ability in my imagination to imagine what life looks like for somebody else, a friend of mine, a family member, or even an enemy figure. To imagine how are they experiencing life. I don't have to agree with it, I don't have to adopt it, but if I can't walk in their moccasins a little bit, certainly any kind of significant relationship is not going to be possible. So just imagining, get inside another person's mindset, soul set, or heart set, and think, why are they acting the way in which they're acting? Why are they believing what they believe? And in some senses, that's maybe the most godlike activity we can do. Because God is literally experiencing herself through all of her creatures. So God is experiencing all of the perspectives of every created creature on the planet. So in that sense, the more perspectives I can adopt, even temporarily, the more godlike I'm becoming. So that would be the second suggestion, perhaps, some kind of a feedback system. And the third would be real prayer. And of course, there are many kinds of prayer. Prayer of praise, prayer of gratitude, the realization that we're being gifted with precious human bodies, at a time in history, when the great evolutionary changes are possible. So gratitude for being here at this stage, praise for being here. And also a prayer of petition, trying to make a difference, intervene somehow in the human system. And I suggest strongly that prayer of petition has 6 components to it. And that the first phase of prayer of petition is a clean heart. There's a great phrase in Mark's Gospel where Jesus says, if you ask the Father anything in my name, I will give it to you. But first, forgive each other from your heart. So prayer is inefficient. Prayer of petition is inefficient if it's coming from a heart which is filled with anger or fear, anxiety, any of these things. If you're attempting to send out love from a place which is corrupted in itself, it's not going to be effective. So the first stage of prayer petition is to look into my heart and find out, is there any anger in me? Is there any unforgiveness in me? Is there any anxiety in me? I have to clean these things out as the first stage of prayer petition. The second thing is, I now need to fill that space with love, with compassion. And compassion is the realization that everything is an aspect of God. I've said to you many times before that, life is simply God in drag. Everything you see and everything you meet and every person you're in contact with is just another aspect of the divine. So compassion is really self-compassion. It's the realization that as a manifestation of the divine is being compassionate for itself. So this compassion then radiates out into the world. The third level of petitionary prayer, I believe, then, is what I would call a kind of a laserized intentionality. Not just, let's pray for, Bill Murphy, who's sick. It's a laserized intention where there's full awareness and I'm beaming my compassion and my intention at this individual. Now, I think intention has three qualities in its own, or three aspects of itself. There's the quality of the intention. Is it a half-assed effort or is it a fully engaged effort? What kind of frequency do I go back again, in order to stay aligned? And how many people are involved? What's the quantity? Is it just one person praying, or a bunch of people praying? The fourth aspect of prayer petition, I believe, is making a real effort. I have to walk the talk. There's no point in me beaming love at somebody and then treating them like dirt when I meet them. So I have to walk the talk, is the fourth piece. The fifth piece then is just to hold the whole thing in God's time and God's way. So it's like I have to be aligned with the metaphysical and the physical reality. Nature, whether we're talking about physical nature or metaphysical nature, tries desperately when it's pushed out of balance to get itself back into a homeostatic area. So if I were to hang a rope off this truss down here and dangle a 1 ton, a piece of steel right in front here, and I said to you, Patricia, can you push that for me? And you come up here and you put your hand up to it and you'll push it very easily. The first 2 or 3 degrees, push it really, really easily. If you have to push it up here, there's actually a mathematical formula. It's the length of the weight of the object multiplied by the cosine of the angle. So if the angle is 90, the cosine of 90 is 0. So there's no weight there. You can just push it very simply. If I'm trying to hold it out here at an angle of 30, it's now nearly 1/4 of a ton in weight. If I get up to 45, it's now 0.8 of a ton. And if I try to push it against the ceiling, hold it up there, I'm trying to hold up a ton. So the further you push a system out of homeostasis, the more it tries to get back into homeostatic balance. And that's true not just physical nature, it's true of the metaphysical nature as well. So nature is on our side. When you're praying to bring a system back into homeostatic balance, when you're praying for the will of God, it's much easier than the people who are trying to push it out of kilter. So that would be the fifth element. You got to work with nature, the metaphysical and the physical nature. And the last piece then is total trust. You have to believe that the system is a journey from God's womb to God's heart. There's no point in putting prayer out there that you don't trust is going to happen. Now the thing is, it may not happen in the way in which you want it to happen or in the timeline that you want it to happen, but that's not your business. You volunteered to come down here, not to execute your own will and impose your own agenda on planet Earth. You came down here, and I came down here, and all 7 billion of us came down here because we volunteered to do God's will on the planet right now, to do our little piece to unstick the chariot wheels of human evolution. So our job is not to figure out to get angry because it's not happening just now or the way in which I want it, but to add my love to the situation. And so at the beginning of this new year, on the first day of 2017, the resolution is this, to be able to stand in front of God and say, thank you, God, for the miracle of a brand new year in which I can try to be a channel of love and light, of life and of laughter, of wisdom and information for our planet and for our times.